It was an eventful Easter week. The Supreme Court halted President Trump's immigration loophole. The U.S. framework to end the war in Ukraine was released, and all roads led to Rome with the loss of Pope Francis the day after meeting Vice President Vance, and the U.S.-Iran round 2 nuclear talks were held there. So today, there are more political Easter eggs to crack open than real ones in the White House Easter egg roll.
Well, speaking of which, the White House Easter egg roll was this week, and it was kind of weird. So Trump said he's bringing religion back to the U.S., and corporations like Amazon, Meta, and YouTube actually sponsored the event, which has never happened before. So according to the sponsor pamphlet, if you shell out $200,000, you'll receive a custom 30 by 30 branded activation and 4 tickets to brunch with the First Lady.
And ethics experts say this wouldn't have passed muster under past administrations, and it's further proof that these tech giants are trying to make inroads with the Trump administration and that Trump seems to be open to them. And we saw that also at the inauguration with all the tech billionaires in the front row.
Yeah, clearly when you have an in with Trump, it pays off. We see that with Elon and Tesla. But it's still just kind of crazy that it's so out in the open like that. There was all of these tech booths and tents just kind of littered across the White House front lawn, advertising in broad daylight. Since when are corporate logos allowed to be so heavily associated with the presidency?
The Trump administration is ready to recognize Crimea as part of Russia, according to the peace framework the U.S. has proposed to Ukraine to end the war.
Which is unusual because it would undo about a decade's worth of U.S. foreign policy, but these talks are happening, and the framework was actually shared with the Europeans and Russians. But Zelensky has said that his government wouldn't recognize any occupied territories as Russian, calling that a red line.
So Crimea is a region in the southern part of Ukraine that's been occupied by Russia since 2014. And according to the UN, Russia has committed a slew of human rights violations against the Ukrainian people there, from unlawful detentions to sexual abuse and torture to forcing children to attend Russian schools.
Moscow is also reportedly Russifying Crimea, so it's basically providing Russian citizens with all of these incentives to actually relocate there. And it's estimated that over 800,000 Russians actually moved there permanently since it was annexed. And that's in comparison to 64,000 Ukrainians that actually fled the area, with the number of refugees estimated to be twice as high.
Well, the U.S. has really backed Ukraine into a corner because both Secretary of State Rubio and President Trump warned that the U.S. will move on from peace talks, quote, within days if there's no tangible sign of progress.
It doesn't really seem to be in line with what the country's demands are, since it takes Ukraine's bid to join NATO off the table.
The Trump administration is also planning another meeting between Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, who's everywhere, and the Russians to get Moscow on board with the framework.
The Trump administration has replaced the government's main portal for information on COVID with a website arguing that the virus was leaked from a lab.
Yeah, COVID.gov used to have information about how to stay healthy, or you could order your test there, but now it's very different. So we're looking at the website, and the first thing we see is, in all caps, lab leak, with a cutout of Trump walking in the middle of it.
I don't know. The true origins of COVID-19.
A moving map.
Very high-tech.
That shows that the Huanan seafood market is 7.5 miles from the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Oh no, picture of Fauci.
And his pardon from Biden.
Of course, an accusation of HHS obstruction.
Classic.
There's no conclusive evidence that masks protected Americans from COVID.
Isn't it just common sense? Oh no, it's 2 cutouts of Cuomo, and it says Andrew Cuomo failure.
Why?
He's not even governor. Trump is going viral for posting a close-up picture of wrongly deported Kilmar Abrego Garcia's knuckle tattoos, claiming they spell out MS-13, the name of a notorious criminal gang. And it's sparking a lot of controversy.
So some people were actually accusing the Trump administration of a botched Photoshop attempt, which I think is a bit too far. It's not like they were actually hoping that people would believe that those were real tattoos.
Yeah, they were clearly just labeling his real tattoos and what they stood for.
But the bigger controversy is, how is the Trump administration so sure that these tattoos actually stand for MS-13? So if you take a look at the photo, it's labeled with marijuana, smiley, cross, and skull. And these symbols haven't been found in any law enforcement guidelines or manual as being identified with MS-13. And apparently the only way to confirm what the symbols actually mean are from informants within the Terrorism Confinement Center in El Salvador.
Yeah, so we really dug into what people were saying to back up this claim that it stands for MS-13. So the M for marijuana, the S for smiley seems self-explanatory, but Y is a cross, a 1, and a skull, a 3. But I guess people speculate with no proof that Kilmar originally had a 13 tattooed there, but that he's covered it up with a cross and a skull. Other people say that the skull stands for a 3 because there's 2 eyes and 1 mouth. But then we were like, What about the nose?
Interestingly, another piece of evidence that law enforcement is really using to make this case is that Abrego Garcia was wearing a Chicago Bulls hat. So a gang field interview sheet from a police department noted that wearing this confirms that he's a member in good standing with MS-13.
ICE has detained people, even students in the past, for wearing Chicago Bulls memorabilia or drawing like a bull and horns on a paper or something. So I guess it is a known gang symbol, but just because you're wearing it doesn't mean it's related. And the White House has been running with these speculations and even corrected a New York Times headline from Senator meets with wrongly deported Maryland man in El Salvador to Senator meets with deported MS-13 illegal alien in El Salvador who's never coming back.
Which is wild, since in court it was revealed that Abrego Garcia was accused of being a gang member in New York, where he never lived. So there's really no hard evidence linking him to any gang activity, which is scary because such flimsy accusations and evidence can get you deported and land you in prison.
Well, the act that the Trump administration used to deport Abrego Garcia and over 200 other accused gang members with no due process, or the Alien Enemies Act, has been temporarily halted by the Supreme Court. So that means Trump can't send anyone else to this infamous CCOT prison in El Salvador.
And this act has only been used 3 times before in U.S. history during periods of declared war. The last time was to send the Japanese to internment camps during World War II.
Apparently, 50 Venezuelans had already been loaded on buses heading to the airport to fly to El Salvador when the Supreme Court's decision came in. So that was paused, which I'm actually surprised Trump didn't carry on anyway, since he's done that in the past, like when he refused to turn the plane around.
So we'll see what happens, since the Supreme Court has signaled that it'll say more in the coming weeks about the Alien Enemies Act. And we're expecting more details about what circumstances exactly can this act be invoked under. So DOGE is bringing in data from the IRS, HHS, Social Security Administration, and voting records and building a master database to surveil and track undocumented immigrants.
So historically, ICE and Homeland Security would need to file a court order in order to obtain this kind of information. And usually it's segmented across multiple departments. So this type of pooling has never happened before.
So Customs and Immigration Services already has like a pre-existing lake of information on undocumented immigrants, but most of that is like about benefits and pending cases. So what DOGE is doing is basically adding all of this data to it, including biometric data like fingerprints and voice recognition. And having all of this in one place makes it just so much easier for the government to surveil, geolocate, and track targeted immigrants in real time.
Obviously, this raises major alarms with experts over privacy violations, not only for undocumented immigrants, but also for citizens. Quote, what we're seeing is likely the first step in creating that centralized dossier on everyone in the country.
Earlier this month, the Department of Homeland Security struck an agreement with the IRS to use tax data to search for more than 7 million migrants that are working and living in the U.S. And apparently high-ranking IRS officials said that this was extremely troubling, and many of them resigned over it.
And ICE is paying software giant Palantir $30 million to build an immigration surveillance platform. Currently, ICE doesn't have any tools for tracking self-deportation in near real time, so this would provide that.
So the platform is called Immigration iOS. So clever. And we actually looked through the filed contract, and it said the app would have 3 core functions that would essentially streamline the identification of aliens and their removal from the U.S. with the goal of making deportation logistics more efficient.
And it's just weird that nowhere in the contract does Palantir explain where they'd even pull this data from. But I guess a prototype is expected in September, so we'll know more then.
And to round out our section on crazy immigration updates, the Trump administration moved to classify more than 6,000 living migrants as dead, canceling their social security numbers. And this basically wipes their ability to work, receive benefits, or even access their banks, and is basically a move to try to get them to leave the country.
The U.S. and Iran met again last weekend in Rome to continue negotiations on a possible nuclear deal, and things seem to be going pretty well. Both parties are ready to move on to discussing the technical details, like what's the maximum level to which Iran can enrich uranium, or what size can their nuclear stock be, or how would they be monitored?
Which is exactly what the Obama-era nuclear deal that Trump called a disaster and pulled us out of did. So we're all kind of waiting to see what Trump and his team can actually pull off, because there's a big chance that what's going to happen is that Trump pulled us out, promised an amazing deal, let Iran enrich uranium for 7 years, and then made the exact same deal again.
But Mabel, he's known as a deal maker, so I have faith he's going to deliver. And there are a couple ways that he could set his deal apart from Obama's. He could insist on full nuclear dismantlement, which is what Netanyahu is obviously pushing for, but Iran seems completely against, understandably. And Trump's team is also split on whether Iran should retain the ability to make nuclear fuel.
We're also curious to see what Iran will actually do with all of the enriched uranium it has, because under the first deal, it actually had to transfer it to another country to comply with terms. And if Iran has to do the same thing now, it would probably have to transfer it to Russia, which is like, why would we want Russia to have weapons grade levels of uranium?
Well, they set a third round meeting for this Saturday, so we'll keep following.
So we thought we'd end this political rundown with something that we never really cover on Newsgirls: ratings. So Trump's approval rating on the economy dropped to the lowest of his presidential career. A survey of Americans showed Trump with 43% approval and 55% disapproval, and that's the first time in any CNBC poll that he's been net negative on the economy.
But that's not all the bad ratings news for Trump, because CNN's latest poll found that among independents, he has the worst approval rating of any president ever at this point in a presidency. The previous record was set by him in his first term, but he's outdone himself this time. I guess independents feel like he's catering too much to his right-wing base.
And Trump is so obsessed with ratings, we kind of assumed that it would be pretty rough for him, but he doesn't seem to have quite come to terms with the reality of the situation. He posted on Truth Social, "Trump's best poll numbers ever, thank you," without revealing the poll that he was referring to.